Hello, everybody, and welcome to Aquarian Radio at aquarianradio.com. And I'm your host, Sasha Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lessin. And today we're speaking with Alfred Webre and Andrew D. Basiago. We're going to have a conversation on various topics, which include, I'll start with Alfred, and he will introduce his topic and tell us a little bit about the background, and then we'll go roundtable and discuss this topic. So take it away, Alfred.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be with you today. And I'd just like to mention for the audience that our distinguished company on this program, which include Sasha Lessin and author Dr. Sasha Lessin and U.S. chrononaut and 2020 presidential candidate Andrew D. Basiago, and yours truly. What I'd like to open up with, and it's something that it's very moving for me to open up with this, which I did publicly for the first time on May 24th, 2017. And I chose that date quite deliberately because a colleague of mine who actually wrote me on that day congratulating me, Dr. Carl Johan Kalaman, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Washington, and who's the author of many books on the Mayan calendar, and who has taken the Mayan calendar beyond. The Mayan calendar really turns out to be a Pleiadian calendar, according to some. And what it does is that it's a map of consciousness, and it maps various waves of consciousness, and it maps the waves that come through the galactic center, which is a black hole, and which is an interdimensional portal, and we're now using some technical terms, but what happened is that on December 21st, 2012, or actually prior to that, there were various markers along the way. One was the harmonic convergence, which was on August 16th to 17th in August 16th to 17th in 1987. And that began to mark our emergence according to different markers. One of the markers was our emergence from a yuga. A yuga is like a certain age or a frequency in this time-space hologram that we're in, and it relates to the great years, which are 12,500 years long. And this marked our emergence from a very dark yuga called the Kali Yuga. And in the Kali Yuga, kind of the software, to use a modern term, an information technology term, the kind of the software or the programming of the Kali Yuga inside our time-space hologram, so that people understand that we're inside a virtual experience. Well, that software operates according to the principle of 1 part virtue and 3 parts sin. And that's why everything that has happened in the 20th century, I mean, World War I, which was just like horrific. It was started by Satanists as a mass sacrifice of the human race. I mean, it's just a total satanic sacrifice, an enormous false flag, so that people like John D. Rockefeller, who was the agent of the Rothschilds in the New World, could make $1 trillion on it. And it was just a complete and total false flag. And it was dedicated to the Ahrimanic powers. It was dedicated to the fourth dimensional and inner earth Draco reptilians. And then we came up with the Depression, quote, end of quote, which after the false flag of the Spanish flu, which was a misnomer, which was carried out by Bayer aspirin, because they knew that by mixing the quote, vaccination against, quote, the Spanish flu with Bayer aspirin, that gave a fatal combination, and that led to about 100 million deaths. And all of this is on the, the same parties that brought you World War I. Well, then we had the Spanish flu. Oh, well, what's an extra 100 million humans? And then we went up to World War II, which was another false flag because, of course, our colleague, Emily Winsor Craig, who's documented all of this in a book, has shown that her father, King Edward VIII, who was forced to abdicate because he was not a Satanist and refused to go along with the false flag of World War II, he was deposed by a conspiracy between King George V, his brother, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who set him up with an MI5 double agent who married him, who was also a Nazi double agent, and in order to bring George V on the throne, so that they could have Adolf Hitler, who was on the German throne, who was actually the half brother of George V and of King Edward VIII. So this was all a false flag to get rid of even more of the surface earthlings and create even more chaos. And this was during the waning years of the Kali Yuga. Well, thankfully, as Dr. Carl Johan Kalaman and many other scholars have told us, on December 21st, 2012, that marked, and actually before that, at the harmonic convergence, that was kind of the beginning of the lead up to the interdimensional portal out of those deeper frequencies here in the time-space hologram of Earth that we find ourselves. And those deeper, darker frequencies are what allow the satanic forces to do their false flags and to engage in their depopulations. Well, in the harmonic convergence, I was privileged with a co-producer of mine at WBAI in New York. I was an on-air host at that time. And using the Boulder, Colorado NPR station, we produced and broadcast, and through the NPR satellite, many NPR stations throughout the U.S., including the Washington, D.C. one, came on, and we were interviewed by the Washington Post. After that, we had Jose Arguelles as a special host, so we sent out the harmonic convergence signal about that, and then a few months later, in October, out of WNYC, we hired the NPR satellite again for $25 because we were with the nonprofit WBAI, a member station in Pacifica, and we worked with Gospel Radio in the then Soviet Union and created the Instant of Cooperation, which was the first live radio program between the Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States in history. And that was carried live in all 11 time zones of Russia, the United States, and in the United States over the NPR satellite. And we had people like Alina Akhmatova, the Russian poet, talking to Allen Ginsberg, who was the premier American poet, in the studios of WNYC. And we had citizens from Moscow on the air talking with citizens of Jersey City who were breaking down, crying that they were talking over the Iron Curtain. And we broke through the energies of the Iron Curtain using the energies of the harmonic convergence. And then, of course, we all went forward to 2012, where we broke through the portal of the Kali Yuga into the Dwapara Yuga, where we are now, and so the software then changed of our virtual program that we're in to 2 parts virtue and 2 parts sin. So we're in the Dwapara Yuga now. And what that means that things are slightly better. So the fact that the news that we posted today on our Facebook page is that the Georgia Guidestones, which recommended depopulation by the Illuminati down to 500 million total Earth population, which is what the Illuminati are trying to propose, and they mysteriously, the Georgia Guidestones disappeared a few months ago, and they suddenly reappeared in Derry, New Hampshire, Derry, in Derry, New Hampshire, and they appeared at what looks like an old amateur, Little League baseball field, and they put up the Georgia Guidestones. I guess they're called the New Hampshire Guidestones now, but I posted it with, and there's a long article that explains this, but I said, oh, gee, how about controller powerless memes? I mean, it's like the laughingstock now, because we're in the Dwapara Yuga now, where it's 2 parts virtue and 2 parts sin, so none of these memes are working anymore. I mean, it used to be that people would get all woo-woo about the Georgia Guidestones. But now, hey, take a hike, right? So now...
Did they change any of the wording? Did they up the level of humans they're going to keep alive, or what did they do?
No, it's still, 500 million is the ideal planetary thing. So somebody in the Illuminati either is playing a practical joke on the Illuminati, or, somebody wrote a check to take down the Guidestones in Georgia, because Georgia, and they put them in New Hampshire. I don't know what's going on there. People can go to my Facebook page, Alfred Webre, and
it means,
you can read the whole
means
thing.
that Andy's got to take New Hampshire before for the next election. That's what it means.
New Hampshire first, then you get the world.
Granite State.
Yeah. So
granite went backward, was originally quarried. Guidestone granite, I think, but anyway, New Hampshire is the granite state.
Yeah, so Andy makes a good point that maybe the Georgia Guidestones were quarried out of New Hampshire granite, and who knows? I mean, I really don't know. So
it's with take a volcanic rock from the Big Island, you have to return it eventually, or you get cursed. Something like
sure.
that.
I mean,
it's got its own fields.
Yeah. Okay. Continue, Alfred. This is interesting.
Yeah. So, many of us who are really interested in the Mayan calendar, which I'm, a number of, find myself in that number, and of course the Mayans, suddenly they disappeared at a certain date, and the thinking in the field is that they ascended, is that they were given instructions, and suddenly a whole civilization, because one of the first field trips that I made in the summer, this is when we were in, I was a junior in university at Yale, and we made a trip, first of all, down to Jalapa, Mexico. We drove straight from New Haven, Connecticut, down to Jalapa, Mexico, and we worked with the people in Jalapa there, and we built them a new facility. We built like a new kind of classroom facility, and we built new laundries there in Jalapa. People probably in the United States know Jalapa for that's the origin of the jalapeno peppers. So I spent a summer there, and at the end of the summer, we drove down to the Yucatan, and we went to all the Mayan ruins. So that was my first introduction to the Mayans, and I learned how to say, do you want to go to bed with me in Mayan, which is Kosh Dun Sikpa? You know, all those phrases that young college people like to pick up. I mean, you know, it was the 60s, guys. And we were typical unconscious, silent generation. I mean, I'm really glad that Dr. Lessin is there, because he's a fellow silent generation. We were just old macho men, right?
We were free, and the charge from confronting the terrible things that were happening to people in my generation and younger, it's what motivated us to just feel sexy and alive and risk it all for the truth. And that's what this program's about. That's what you're about, and that's what Andy's about. And I'm so glad to be part of this. Go on, Alfred.
and I was like that. I was 14 years younger than this man, so I was just a little. I was the what do you call it? The flower child. I was the last of the flower children, but I was still a baby boomer. So I was old enough to appreciate it. I am so grateful that I was alive in the 60s, that I had you, Alfred, and Andy. Sasha. I actually heard about an incident that Sasha was involved in when I was living in Pittsburgh and he was in Hawaii. But I don't want to divert. But most of the kids out there don't really quite get what the 60s were about. So thank you for reminding us about that.
Right. So then...
It was great.
Yeah, so then we all remember where we were on December 21st, 2012. Maybe we don't remember where we were on that date, but we all remember some kind of a significance, because it was highly promoted in our community, as I recall.
For sure.
And there's a lot of controversy as to whether it was 2012 and what the meaning of it was. However, think of that as a portal into a new frequency, into a new consciousness, if for those humans who want to access that new consciousness. Because think of the universe and our time-space hologram as a machine for developing souls and developing consciousness. And so we're here, and as individual humans, we're given the option and the free will to increase our consciousness and develop our consciousness as we wish. Now, fast forward to May 24th, 2017, and that was my 75th birthday. So Dr. Carl Johan Kalaman, prior to that, who is one of the leading scholars on the Mayan calendar and on the ninth wave, and it turns out that May 24th, 2012, and I have a gentleman sitting next to me who was born on May 29th, which is John F. Kennedy's birthday. He comes out with a paper saying that May 24th is the 64th day of the ninth wave within this system of the Mayan, really the Pleiadian calendar, which is how to navigate the various consciousness waves and consciousness gates inside the system that we're in. And one can use those tools really to take maximal advantage of the ascension frequencies and maximal advantage of the soul development possibilities in this planet. And to make a long story short, you can go to exopolitics.com, newsinsideout.com, or to my Facebook page, and there are multiple articles about this that we've posted by Dr. Kalaman and other articles. He says, well, we've been through the harmonic convergence. We've been through December 21st, 2012, and May 24th, 2017 is the day, get this, that Christ consciousness starts landing on the planet. It starts landing on the planet. So as of May 24th, 2012, according to this advanced scholar, those who wish it can now access Christ consciousness. And you remember, whatever people believe about the historical Jesus, one of his sayings, even as I have done, so can you do.
And more.
And more. And so, as of May 24th, according to Dr. Kalaman, who is really the real deal, he says, Christ consciousness, in other words, a certain frequency of unity consciousness, is now landed on our planet, and you can start accessing it. And my gosh, that was on my 75th birthday. So I said to myself, this is the day that I really should announce the ET abduction, the very special linked ET abduction of Jimmy Carter, JC, who, when he ran for president, they used to call him JC and the 12 Apostles, because they had 12 apostles who followed JC, who came out and became president out of nowhere. The linked abductions of Jimmy Carter from 1969 to 1975, Alfred Webre, and the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Washington, Oregon, and North Carolina, Andrew D. Basiago. And so I said, what better day to announce this? Because Christ consciousness is landing, and so I will have finally a maximal number, theoretically, of human consciousnesses who are open to this information. Because if I had opened my mouth starting in 1973, which is when I had my abduction experience in February of 1973, and had done it at any point between then and May 24th, 2017, given even now the current atmosphere inside the exopolitical community, let alone the ongoing 3D world, I would have been laughed out of town on a good day. I would have been made mincemeat on a bad day. So I decided that was the time to announce it, and I invested $150 and went to what's considered the best PR company in town in the U.S. called PR Web, and I put down my money and I had to call them up because I didn't know if they were going to say that. What? You were abducted with Jimmy Carter? I didn't know if they were going to accept my money and print it. You know what I'm saying? Even with all the credentials I had, saying that Jimmy Carter and I, and and Andrew Basiago were abducted, and that led to my being the director of the Jimmy Carter White House Extraterrestrial Communications Study, just 4 years after my abduction, and I was abducted.
So what happened?
What? And I was abducted in January.
Abducted, huh? What happened?
What?
Oh, we lost your sound.
Oh.
What happened?
Alfred, can I jump?
Yeah.
Maybe I could pick up the thread here.
Yeah, please.
This is a difficult sort.
I like the build-up. I was just like, oh, what happened? Go ahead.
Well, this is
Andy.
somewhat of a difficult straddle for me to make because I wanted to talk about my recent presentation in Yale, Washington on June 30th, The Truth About the Truth Movement. So just to briefly caption, because it relates to what Alfred's talking about, I'll try to relate some of the domain issues that I wanted to discuss. But basically, in that talk, I described my interactions with 35 fairly prominent figures in the truth movement, and I predicted that the truth movement, I stated that the truth movement is failing and will fail because of defects in 3 areas, basically ego, ethics, and epistemology. There's the politics of personality is governing. There is a lack of ethicality in the truth movement regarding searching for the truth and maintaining a discourse that's able to find it. And then we have, and this is germane to the point that Alfred's making, and I'm here to provide testimony for his abduction account, which is we're not really discussing the epistemology of what's happening to people adequately. So let me just let me provide some eyewitness testimony about Alfred's abduction and kind of explain some of the backstory to the piece that he published linking Carter and himself and myself in that 1969 to 75 period. Alfred and I were on a project in 2006 with the filmmaker Tanya Maidenford that was variously called EXO and Experiencer. And what it was an attempt to do a kind of a documentary that would survey major figures in ufology and exopolitics. When we were working on that in 2006, I informed Alfred and Tanya of the fact that we had been linked in an ET abduction going back 30 years previously to literally the 1975-76 time frame. So for me, in 1975, just to give you an idea here, I was 14 years old. Tanya was 6. She's 8 years younger than I. And Alfred was around 30 years of age. He was in his early 30s. Now, what happened is I had physical contact with the small grays from earliest childhood. And like a lot of contactees, I had a number of physical encounters, and then I had a much more extensive pattern of what's called psychological abduction. That is basically lucid dreams and metaphysical experiences that followed the initial physical encounters with the small grays. We can speculate as to why I had them. Obviously, my father had been working on advanced jet aircraft to chase the ETs out of our atmosphere, beginning with the Ramjet project in 1952 at Curtiss Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey. Then there's the issue of the fact that as a child time traveler, I was frequently entering pardon me, I was frequently in the domain that the ETs travel in, namely the superluminal reaches of the quantum hologram. So they might have detected my presence and then decided to investigate me. And there's obviously very advanced tracking of specific human beings, and that's one of the most significant aspects of this account, and it's one of the reasons I've agreed to step up and validate and verify and provide corroborative testimony to Alfred's abduction story linking himself and Carter. And that is that what happened is I found myself in a clearing being beamed aboard a ship that may have been physical in my hometown of Morris Plains, New Jersey. There were many fields between different forests, different woodlands in the neighborhood. It may have been a lucid dream or in the nature of a psychological abduction, but I basically was taken aboard an ET craft. This would be a craft of the small grays in a luminous blue shaft of light emanating from the bottom of the ship. And when I got to the entry, sort of the gangway, the entry that a lot of contactees and abductees have reported, where there's almost like airport furniture when you're initially taken aboard the bottom of the craft. There's this sort of utilitarian furniture that's very much like the furniture that you find in today's airports on Earth. A little 6-year-old blonde girl was holding a Barbie doll and said to me, "My Barbie's a blondie too." Now, Tanya's nickname in 2006, going all the way back to earliest childhood, was Blondie. She confirmed. I was taken aboard the craft, and then at some point I was transported across the country. Actually, I was in California at that time, so I would have been transported north. And I found myself in a kind of a scenario very much like a lucid dream. And what I was witnessing was a tragedy in the life of a young girl in which she was living in a rural setting adjacent to woods. And, I was 5, 6 years old. And she ran over to her swing set, and she found a cow that she had adopted as a pet in this rural childhood had been slaughtered and was hanging from her swing set. And I watched her as I both watched and intuited her experience as she was shocked to find this beloved cow hanging, and then ran around her house and ran past her front door with her mother looking out the screen door, and ultimately ran down the street and grabbed her and brought her into the living room. I then watched as this 6-year-old blonde child cried her eyes out for an hour or two as her father was explaining that, he had to provide for the family, and this is where beef comes from cattle, and the family needed to eat and survive, and he was sorry that he had slaughtered her favorite cow on their rural property. And I then found myself aboard the ship again, and I asked telepathically one of the small grays, "What part of the country am I over?" And he said, "Idaho." And as you'll see, as I elaborate, that was significant. I then landed somewhere else in the country, and I saw a lenticular craft on the ground with a metal shaft coming out of the bottom of it that had holes in it all the way around the cylinder. And I went under the craft and looked in. I was almost being invited to do so. And I saw Alfred. Now, I would be able to confirm that it was Alfred years later in 2005 when I edited his book Exopolitics. Alfred sent me a cache of photographs of himself, including pictures of him in his early 30s. And he may recall that I said to him at that time, that was the young man in my psychological abduction involving the Greys, where I basically was shown that traumatic event in the real life of our 2006 experiencer, E.T. documentary colleague Tanya Maidenford, because Tanya confirmed that in fact that incident had happened. And I had been put there to the level of seeing every element of that pretty profound trauma in her childhood. She said it was the most traumatic thing that had ever happened to her and provoked the greatest emotional response, naturally and understandably. And what was so remarkable about that scenario that was woven, whether it was in dream time or whether I had really been picked up by the Greys, is that it linked a trauma in Tanya Maidenford's childhood to what Alfred was doing in 1975 and 76. Now, of course, in 1977, Alfred would author the ET Human Communication Study for the Carter White House, and I had already worked in the area of ET Human Communication when, in 1971, both in New Jersey and New Mexico, I was tutored in thousands of hieroglyphic symbols in the Astarte alphabet, which is the Sumerian-derived pictographic hieroglyphic alphabet that the Defense Department was developing to allow contactees like myself to communicate with the ETs, not telepathically, but by pointing to symbols. So, for example, the symbol for Earth, which is seen from outside our solar system as a tiny planet in front of a huge sun, is simply a circle with a dot in the middle, representing Earth superimposed over the vast sun behind it. And there are just thousands of these symbols. I learned about 250 or so in New Jersey, and then you may recall that I jumped from, in fall of 1971, and then I jumped from fall of 1971 to the beginning of the summer of 73 in New Mexico. And while, among other things, taking Montauk chair probes to my future under the tutelage of Major Ed Dames, there in a lab underneath the Los Alamos Public High School, the auxiliary gym at Los Alamos High School, I was being tutored, so I ultimately acquired a working knowledge of about 2,000 of the symbols in that alien-human communication protocol, which Alfred would then elaborate on in another phase of ET human communication studies for the Carter White House. So what was really amazing, and it really shows...
Let me ask you something about that incident. So you're saying you and Tanya and Alfred were all taken during the same abduction, and was Carter there as well during that same time?
Let me address both those questions in terms of us and then with Carter. What I was sharing with them is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay. What I was saying is, in that abduction experience, or that psychological abduction that occurred merely in dream time, we know, for example, when we're dreaming, that in the lucid dreaming phase, what's called the pongio-occipital wave function, we have authentic experience just like we have when we're awake. It was one of those very lucid dream sequences, I believe. And what I shared with...
Basically, because the repeated exposure to those type of environmental changes and, affect the body, so often they will take experiencers, in other ways to have it. But it's just as real. It's just as valid and just
right. But I'm saying whether it was psychological or physical abduction, I was still right there. I experienced not only what happened at the Maidenford household involving, her pet cow, but also I intuited emotionally what she was experiencing. And then in the same set of images, I was essentially given an eyewitness opportunity to see that Alfred was a contactee, because he was standing there in this cylinder that was extruded from the bottom of a disc-shaped craft. So the amazing thing, and this goes to the epistemology that I'm trying to address in the truth movement. For example, recently there was a significant controversy involving the claims of Corey Goode, and just this morning, just before we went on, synchronously, Facebook invited me to renew my friendship with Whitley Strieber, and I've been using Whitley Strieber's writings as an example of actually the domain that I think we have to address these non-ordinary experiences in. One of my complaints about what's happening in the truth movement is that multidimensional experience. Let me just go off on this tangent for a while, because it ultimately relates to how we can interpret what happened.
I want to just finish. I'd like to just finish I want to go back to Alfred for just a minute to get the connection between your abduction and Carter, and then we'll go to you for.
I can't verify Carter's abduction. Alfred's going to have to explain that, because that links to his own work for Carter. What I'm corroborating is that these three colleagues in 2006 had been part of the same scenario, apparently architected by the Small Greys, 30 years previously. I mean, I met Alfred in 1999-2000, literally 25 years after the dream, and then I met Tanya in 2004, almost 30 years later, 28 years later.
So, Andrew, if you were orchestrating all these events for a desired outcome, what is the purpose of letting Andy and Alfred and Tanya become conscious of their contact with each other in Carter at this time? What is this all about?
Well, we can only speculate about the purposes and higher functions of the ETs, but my point is, they were able, because I wasn't guiding it. I don't think I was generating the contact. I think I was being shown things. I was shown a key trauma in Tanya's childhood, like we all have, serious traumas in childhood. That was her major one. And I was also being shown the 30-year-old, 32-year-old Alfred Webre, who would become a colleague 25 years later. What I'm pointing up is how sophisticated that was for the small grays to arrange. They were able to identify 3 people who were in synchrony on a project level in 2006 for a documentary that wasn't even made. And they gave one of the participants, myself, the opportunity to literally meet individuals that I wouldn't meet for 25 and 28 years respectively, and then wouldn't work on the project together for 31 years. And they were giving me insight into a trauma in Tanya's childhood and insight into Alfred's status as a contactee right before he was working on the ET human communication protocol for the Carter White House. So I thought, just ethically speaking, I had to step up and verify Alfred's account because I know it was them. I'm absolutely certain. There was nobody that I knew that looked like Alfred at the time. The pictures of him from that time period are spot on. Tanya still uses the nickname Blondie. All of our friends call her Blondie. She was growing up in Idaho. The cow had been slain by her dad for food to feed the family, and he had suspended it from her swing set, which, think about it, that's a highly discreet event, and it's a fairly horrific one. And if I hadn't been shown Alfred standing near that craft, there would have been no third-party corroboration of his status as a contactee. Now, right, okay, now, in the epistemology of the truth movement, this is the point I wanted to make in terms of what I thought I would be discussing today, but which I presented in late June at the Triad Theater in Yelm, which is we are looking at multidimensional experiences through an improper lens, and it's leading to all of this argument in the field. Whether that argument is ethical or unethical. For example, Corey Goode was attacked first by Bill Ryan, who had actually launched Corey Goode. Corey, of course, having described in a set of productions on Gaia TV under the show named Cosmic Disclosure with his colleague David Wilcock, had described his contacts with the Blue Avians. So we have to make it clear that Corey Goode is an abductee. He's a contactee. And first Bill Ryan pulled the carpet out from underneath Corey, stating that he had made up his account and he was not a voracious contactee. And then a young enterprising journalist named Daniel Robillard, using the alias Daniel List under the trade name Dark Journalist, did a six-part series on Corey attacking him. And then different people in exopolitics and ufology on social media, including Randy Moggins, Alfred, and myself, began to jump in and sort of begin to reality test Corey's claims. But ultimately, I had qualms about that, not only because as an experiencer, I don't want to put myself in the role of evaluating other people's experiences. I don't want to become what Richard Dolan is in my life. What I realized is there's an epistemological error we're making, which is we're applying the scientific materialism, which of course was the bane of Carl Sagan, to evaluate experiences that are going on interdimensionally. And as regarding a claimant who had approached me by the name of Lindsay Hooper, stating that she had contact with me on Mars in 1984, which was the year I left the Mars project, and the year she was born, I initially said to her, Lindsay, this cannot be a real account that you're believing that you had, because you were born in 84 and I left the project in 84. And then I realized that when she described a scene in which I was leaving Mars and I had said to one of the personnel there, I want you to look after her for me, that I had that experience, but in dream time. But in Lindsay's reality, she had it in the waking state. And I thought, that's it. Look, I began to advocate what I call objectified open-mindedness, which is we cannot apply the boundaries and the definitions of scientific materialism to the non-ordinary experiences, the multidimensional experiences people are having, for example, in contact with off-planet intelligences. Because if we apply that scientific materialistic worldview, we prevent the multidimensional nature of what's going on from being understood. and we begin arguing at cross purposes. Let me give an example in Corey's account, and then I'll relate back to Alfred and the story involving Alfred and Tanya.
Okay,
Corey claimed, Corey and again his host, his interviewer David Wilcock claimed that after the discoveries were made in Antarctica of either extraterrestrial, ancient human, or ancient extraterrestrial artifacts in Antarctica, that a spaceship had appeared behind Corey's residence and picked him up and took him to Antarctica. Now, Alfred and I had even discussed the potential reality of that and the historicity of it. And I had even commented on it that it sounded really like an attempt to jump on the bandwagon and associate Corey with the Antarctica phenomenon that's just broken as a news story. But in fact, the world we're living in is one in which previously, for example, two people could have a disagreement about a shared experience, and we used to say that either one was wrong or both were wrong. Now we know in the new physics that two people who share a common experience can disagree about what happened, and they can both be right. So, for example, my point here is that Corey could have seen an extraterrestrial craft appear behind his house, whereas his next-door neighbor wouldn't have been able to see it. In other words, we're talking about multidimensional experience from a unidimensional, scientifically materialistic epistemology that is no longer valid. Now, that doesn't mean every claimant is talking about things that have really happened to them. So, for example, complicating my analysis is the fact that I have established through pretty assiduous research, through a pretty, I think, an authentic investigation, that Gaia TV is taking elements of my life story and my public narration of my experiences going on over 10 years now, going back to 2004. That was 13 years ago when I first started talking about my time travel experiences. And then in 2010, 7 years ago, I began talking about my Mars experiences. I have found elements of my life story in Gaia TV's accounts of the life experiences of Randy Kramer and Corey Goode. So there's the complicating factor of how do we analyze whether somebody's coming forward as an authentic experiencer or somebody's emulating the already public claims of a previous experiencer. But then once we get past that initial analysis of credibility and of the source of their information, we're still left with the epistemological dilemma. Could I have been present at their experience and not experienced what they experienced, and could they have authentically experienced it? So, for example, Bill Ryan, who again just pulled out the rug from Corey, who he had launched as a whistleblower. Bill Ryan's position on me, which goes back to, my interactions with Bill Ryan and Carrie Cassidy at Project Camelot began 10 years ago in 2007, and I appeared actually as a favor to them for free. I wasn't even paid. I appeared in their TV pilot for True TV called Shadow Operations. And their position on me has migrated from believing my time travel account to believing my time travel account and not believing my Mars account, to using my Mars account to discredit my time travel account. And now, without anything having changed, Bill Ryan is claiming that I'm the most useful kind of agent provocateur for the U.S. government because I believe what I'm describing. His insinuation is that my experiences didn't happen, but I believe they happened. Okay. So that motivated my talk in Yelm recently, where I listed 35 prominent people. I don't know if you can see this, 35 prominent people in the truth movement. And there has been zero credibility on the level of getting past the egoic projections of the individuals, maintaining a code of ethics in the truth movement about how we handle other people's claims and other people's reputations. I've been accused of everything by Richard Hoagland of being a non-person, a CIA legend, to having committed mass atrocities that people actually believe. In fact, Bill Ryan was promoting the notion I had perpetrated mass atrocities. And then we have to get into the epistemology of what people are claiming. And what has actually happened is, my thesis is that the truth movement has imploded and is applying the old scientific materialism that we had pretty much as a group discredited, which is to say that Corey Goode's claims of his interactions with the Blue Avians may have occurred to him, but not in ways that we could later reality test and say, Corey Goode met with the Blue Avians just like Madame Curie discovered radium. Okay, or if I put this water on a gas stove, it'll start boiling. Okay, and so as a result, there is a schism in the truth movement between those who are basically propagating falsehoods and those who are defending the truth. But in the interaction between those two factions, we've lost hold of the epistemology that we were originally defending. Now, what I mean by that is, like, when I was time traveling, my father and I were in.
You've got to pass it back to Alfred for a while, and then let us talk. So if you
the linkage here,
it's wonderful.
Right. The linkage here is I'm providing eyewitness testimony of Alfred being a contactee, and I'm defending that. I'm saying I can't scientifically prove what that dream meant, but it was really Alfred, and it was him in his early 30s at the time right before he did the ET communication study for Carter and the Carter White House. So I'll pass the baton to Alfred and ask him to address how he then makes the Carter connection, because this really does go to the kind of epistemology we have to apply.
So Sasha and I can
discern
make some comments. Back to Alfred. Okay, first of all, I read about a report where they're redefining what dreams are, and dreams are actually another dimension. When you sleep, you are somewhere, and you're working. You might be working your other job or living another life. So they're redefining that whole thing. So we get bogged down in the details.
To include.
So,
to include. What's the corollary of what I was saying?
Yeah, we live in a multi-dimensional reality, and everybody has their own individual idioverse. And so we have to allow everybody's idioverse, because we're going to miss information that's important to create our group consensus, to create that positive timeline where we're all, at least am, I'm actively working towards a positive outcome for us, because right now it seems like we're going towards World War III. And I was going to ask Alfred, when did they decide to call World War I World War II? Was it after World War II started? So I don't remember that because I wasn't there. What did you want to say?
Well, I would just say, if you follow the money, who's paying for and profiting by the entertainment provided by Guyam and Corey and Wilcox, and I think you might get some clean analysis of just what's going here. And the truth, when people bother to challenge the kind of evidentially balanced testimony that you're able to give, and these other people aren't, it just calls attention to the fact that that's what's being snowed, and who's budgeting the snowing, and what are their motives. And I think I'm glad you raised this stuff.
Well, it also is like, where is the truth? There's no the truth. There is a truth. And where do people believe what they're saying, and where do we fault them, and who's putting that in there? Is that memory? Is it something injected? Is it just, you could have 20 people witnessing an event. You had 20 different variations on a situation, and it was all live for them.
But you also had...
It's a domain problem. Look, the domain problem in epistemology, we have to determine how we're describing what we're talking about, so that, for example, I can say that my dad and I were interacting with Harold Agnew when he was the director of the Los Alamos National Laboratories. Then I can say, on this chronovisor probe, I'm in that Whitley Strieber realm of a soft-edged reality, right? And what we're doing is we're taking everything everybody's saying, and we're back in the old scientific materialistic worldview, which doesn't apply. So I'm standing up in this interview, and I'm saying, I know it was Alfred and Tanya in that dimension, and I was given contact with them 30 years in advance of our work together. And so maybe Alfred can now make the tie-in to Jimmy Carter and his work for him.
Good. And I also want to just support Trinette. I was shown two of my lovers when they were children. We were about 8 or 9 years old, and then I became lovers with them. I didn't recognize them from then, but when I was going through their childhood pictures, I literally saw the picture, and my mouth dropped, and I dropped the picture and went, oh my God, I was on board ship with that little boy. So, Alfred, your turn.
Okay, wow, I'm really enjoying this conversation. And before I would like to make a statement, which is in response to a question that both Janet and Sasha asked, which is, what is the intent of the ETs to create this linked abductions of Carter, Weber, and Basiago? And I have a statement on that which I'd like to deliver, and it's this. I believe that these three linked abductions were about the following, and think of the book that came out. I actually interviewed him, a former Los Angeles Times editor and reporter named Philip Kraft, who was who was abducted and wrote a book about the Verdants, that were the name of the ETs, and he described a scene in which he was aboard craft, and there were many kind of chosen leading humans who were open to this, and they were kind of being coached and developed by the ETs to go back into society and be kind of prophets and ambassadors to announce all of the world changes that were going to happen, and to kind of be disclosure ambassadors, okay, and to fulfill certain roles. So that is, and then think about Jimmy Carter, Alfred Webre, and Andy Basiago in that kind of a capacity, okay? That's what occurred during the abductions. We were up there with a bunch of other people, and we were inside halls. We were being given lectures. We were watching films. We were kind of being prepared for our roles. Now, so I'm going to make this statement, which is a working hypothesis. These three linked abductions were about, one, coordinating the 1976 election of President Jimmy Carter as a disclosure president. Number two, coordinating the 1977 Carter White House ET study, of which I would become director. Please remember that when I was abducted in February of 1973, the month before, I was general counsel of the EPA. I didn't know anything about ETs. I hadn't started anything. And 4 years later, I was directing the White House study. I learned all my stuff in seminars aboard ET craft. Number three, in the long run, the Carter, Basiago, and Weber ET abductions were about the coordination of President Jimmy Carter's election as an ET disclosure president, and Andy Basiago's possible future election as an ET disclosure president, which has been reportedly pre-identified by DARPA CIA time travel, according to Project Pegasus time travel officers, as Alfred was director of President Carter's ET study and has had a time travel quantum entanglement with Andy Basiago since 1971, when DARPA time traveled Alfred's book Exopolitics from 2005 back to 1971, and an ET abduction relationship with Andy since 1975, when ETs who abducted me and Carter showed Andy the images of my 73 abduction aboard their spaceship. Okay, now let me add this one short passage, and then I'll turn it back, because I really want to hear what Andy has to say about current ET, and I'd like to hear more about the 35 usual suspects. The 1975, this is very important, I think. The 1975 Carter White House ET study, had it not been terminated in 1977 by the Pentagon and by men in black, MIBs, may have led to the treaty abrogation of the secret Greada treaties with the Dracos reptilians, Orion Greys, and Anunnaki reptilians, which President Eisenhower signed in 1954, and which these ETs abused into a planetary and galactic pedocriminal trade of millions of human children and adults annual for ritual sacrifice, loosh, cannibalism, body parts, all enforced by the U.S. government and pedocriminal institutional New World Order worldwide. Because the Pentagon unlawfully terminated the 1977 Carter White House extraterrestrial study, President George H.W. Bush signed the Tau 9 Treaty with the Draco Orion Greys and Anunnaki, and the pedocriminal abuses on Earth have become exponentially worse. We are now preparing a project and a proposal to have the Greada and Tau 9 treaties abrogated by a sitting U.S. president, be that the current president or a future president, including Andrew D. Basiago. And that is a cause to which myself, the gentleman who's next to me, Richard Scheck, who's a Harvard law graduate, who brought the impeachment articles against Richard Nixon, who's a distinguished public career, and who I would like to enroll all of the guests on this program and the host on this program. I'll be presenting this in much more detail at the Yelm UFO and Symposium, July 28th to 30th, Yelm, Washington, which I would like to suggest that all listeners attend, because this is an important, with this abrogation, we can terminate the rule of the Draco reptilians, Orion Greys, and Anunnaki reptilians of a pedocriminal matrix on the planet that's enforced by the U.S. government. Even the FBI are under standing orders not to go after any missing children, and this has been since 1954. And with the stroke of a pen, look, the U.S. president just abrogated the TPP and abrogated the climate treaty. He's used to abrogating treaties. With the abrogation of these treaties, we change the game on the planet, and that's how we land paradise on Earth. So that's my statement.
Dr. Lessin wants to say something.
Just the epistemological question is interesting to me. I would say that from my perspective, everything's perfect, and that the challenges we face, the horrendous challenges, are what motivates us to action, to righteous action. And so that it's perfect once you add the reflectiveness that Andrew and you, Alfred, bring to us. That these challenges are our opportunities to do way better. That's what I think.
And I to add, that would go back to Andy, is that if we take all of our connections here, connect the dots of just these people here, and then put it out to like Lori and Fenton, and even to Jane that's doing the Yelm conference, we have some kind of higher level orchestration. Like when I met Andy, I called him because of a Facebook message that we had started a year before to the exact hour, like the exact minute, and it said. And Andy said, call me. And I didn't recognize it was the year later. So I called him right away, and then he was having difficulties in Maui here. And I said, I'll be over to pick you up. I never met him in person. These types of things are happening. I came in 1954, February 54. I came in 2 years earlier. My mother aborted me or miscarried me. And so I came back right in time, February 54 for the beginning of this thing. I have been an ET contact since the crib. I came in with full memory of who I was as an eternal being. screaming. I had to stifle it because I was getting in trouble with my parents and people. I couldn't shut my mouth up, but the ET stepped in and stopped me from saying too much. But here, this whole thing of how I met Sasha is a miracle. These things are happening on this level. Someday we'll all sit down. We won't do it on this show, but just connect the dots of how it was orchestrated for all of us to meet, and our team is gathering, and we're about to blow the lid off of this. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Andy, and I'll be right back. I got to get a fresh cup of tea, but I can hear you. Keep
it's a
talking.
coherent field that we're making for ourselves and for our listeners and the people we're going to meet at this wonderful festival in Yelm.
Right, and I would just like to emphasize that, at the time that I was shown Alfred's abduction, from dating back to 1973, I had already been involved in the ET human communication process going back to pre-visiting 1973 from 1971. So there was a time synchrony centered around 1973. I'm now seeing his 1973 abduction from my vantage point in 1975-76. His life is turning him towards the Carter ET study without any background in extraterrestrialism or exopolitics. And a colleague from 30 years in the future is being implicated in the scenario. That shows a level of intelligence and design, stage managing, that goes far beyond anything humans on Earth are capable of even perceiving, much less orchestrating. So that's an aspect of what happened that I wanted to emphasize, that we tend to talk about extraterrestrials in spaceships when in fact we're dealing with interdimensionals in time ships. And I think that's exhibited by this particular story, that their ability to identify the three of us and have me interact with Alfred and Tanya so far in advance of our practical colleagueship and friendship is just astonishing. I mean, there's 7 billion people on this planet. And so that's why I felt compelled to step up and corroborate that, yes, it was Alfred, and I don't know specifically whether it was his 1973 abduction, but it very well could have been. He was about 29, 30, 31 in his appearance during what I was shown. And Tanya has confirmed the trauma that occurred in their life regarding that part of the scenario I was shown. So,
let me just say how important this is. That here's what they've established by design. You have created a set of witnesses to experiences that you talk about and descriptions that you make, that when you're cross-examined, you provide details that any imposter wouldn't be able to have. So what disinformation and information, like you give us information, does is it gives us some hypotheses to test out, and yours hold up and have a level of detail and witnesses that the people that you're contesting don't. That's my analysis of the clarity that you bring to this situation.
Well, that's true, but I would emphasize the fact that if you look through my analysis of my interactions with 35 prominent figures in the truth movement, let me just give some of the behavioral patterns. Jesse Ventura covered me fairly in my time travel experiences, but then at the end of that segment, egotistically pronounced that I was clearly a victim of government mind control and not somebody who helped the federal government pioneer time travel. So a former governor of a state, Jesse Ventura, missed the story. He had to interpolate his own explanation and egotistically pronounce that I was a mind control victim, which I'm not. I'm a former U.S. chrononaut and astronaut. Okay. We have, just as another example, I met Dr. Michio Kaku in the early 80s at an event in West Los Angeles sponsored by Dan Hirsch, the founder of the Committee to Bridge the Gap, which was an anti-war and anti-nuclear group in L.A. when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. Dan was one of my professors. And I introduced myself to Dr. Kaku, and I asked him for his opinion regarding advanced applications in quantum physics. And he said, "What do you mean, time travel and that kind of thing?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, well, I wasn't allowed to have access to those files at LANL and then the defense community because I conscientiously objected and refused to do thermonuclear weapons development with Dr. Edward Teller, who, of course, was on Project Pegasus. I had met Teller on Pegasus. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, so I can't tell you because I was basically blacklisted from being briefed on the other things that our atomic labs have achieved besides building more destructive nuclear weapons with the involvement of Dr. Teller. And then I said to Dr. Cock, it was 1981-82 time frame, I said, well, I was on a project under DARPA in which we were teleporting across the country. And instead of asking me about what had happened to me, this scientist, Dr. Kaku, snapped his back to me and quickly walked across the lecture hall to avoid any further discussion with me. But then decades later, when he was about my Project Pegasus account, when he was a guest on American Perspectives on C-SPAN, Dr. Kaku, who's written several brilliant books about the feasibility of time travel, certainly that are independently highly accomplished works, intellectually speaking, opined that my account was quote-unquote fiction. Well, you can't make a judgment, you can't reach a conclusion before you evaluate all the evidence. And going back 30 years, he hadn't evaluated the fact that I was telling him I had teleported under Dr. Agnew in one of the very projects that he was blocked from having knowledge of because of his refusal to do thermonuclear weapons development with Dr. Teller. I described how journalism has been produced about my claims by people like Ray Villard. Ray Villard is the leading advocate of the use of satellites. He's basically NASA's publicist for the Hubble Space Telescope. When I published my landmark paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, in 2008, Mr. Villard stated, and I quote, "If Basiago is so certain that there are these little leprechauns on Mars, why doesn't he show any in his paper?" When in fact, going back to when I was allowed to read my paper in 1971, 37 years before I would write it, because it had been time traveled back in time by DARPA CIA, just as Alfred's book Exopolitics had been. The reason that that paper had been prioritized is it's the first paper to show that another celestial body in our solar system is inhabited, and the first paper to show images of human and animal life forms on another planet. And here we have the publicist for the Hubble Space Telescope, a high NASA official, literally trying to invalidate my paper by saying I didn't include in it the very elements that make it a significant work in natural history. So we have people in the truth movement that are spinning the very reality of written artifacts from people doing research in the field based on being experiencers. I mean, I could go on and on. Bill Ryan concluding that I'm the perfect agent of the federal government's cover-up of these matters, even though I've been revealing what the government has done, because I believe so much what I'm saying. Well, I believe what I'm saying because I experienced it, not because he subjectively projects egoically that I'm again the mind control assertion. I just went through. I mean, I was covered very fairly by the ABC affiliate KOMO in Seattle. Now, Seattle is America's 12th largest city. I have practiced law in Washington State honorably and well for 21 years without a client complaint. I voluntarily went up to Seattle from my law office in Vancouver, Washington, because I was invited by Matt Markovich of KOMO to talk about my time travel experiences. He gave me a completely fair coverage, and then he used the big lie, the disparagement of somebody's character that's also rife in the field. He said, Basiago is so certain of his time travel claims. This is how he ended a very fair broadcast where he allowed me to present my experiences. He said that I was so certain of my time travel experiences that I was either a pathological liar, a sociopath, or the fastest thinking science fiction writer on the planet. So we have a situation where there is vilification of truth tellers, of people who have served the country as an ordinary matter of course by the mainstream media, and that derogatory, vilifying fallacious approach that's been applied by the mainstream media against experiencers like myself has now been emulated by the alternative media, which was one of the reasons I spoke out in Yelm on June 30th. Ralph Steiner of NPR was... Yeah.
The culture house, it's like they can't believe things. It's like who was that? It was talking about the God virus, the virus and the antivirus. You come in, you're born into a certain part of the culture. Let's say you're Christian or you're Muslim, and you come in with that belief structure because of where you're born and what you get imprinted with, and then you have the antivirus. You can't believe the opposite, no matter what evidence is available, because it contradicts your own life and your own life force and your right livelihood and all those things that you on a conscious, subconscious level value to have a life. So you're contradicting their reality, and it's just a natural knee-jerk reflex to...
They're doing something that's invalid. They're saying, my reality is your reality, when in fact we know that when what we call ordinary experience occurs, we're only having a semi-overlapping reality. So I use the example of three friends meeting on campus. One friend runs into the other friend, and then let's say a third classmate joins them for this discussion, and then one of the original two goes to class, and number 2 and 3 have a conversation, and then they part. Okay. None of those three undergraduates had the same experience of being in college with the others. They all had different, they were all in different dimensions, their own dimension. So even in ordinary experience, we can't correlate my reality to yours to Sasha's. We only have a semi-overlapping set of experiences. So, for example, Alfred, I'm sure will remember this incident. I wrote a 10-page, single-spaced, tightly worded brief for the Vancouver 9/11 Tribunal back in around, I think I filed it on 9/11 of 2012, 11 years after the event. I think it was dated 9/11/12, and if I'm not mistaken. And in that brief, in that affidavit, which I was going to, and I wanted to present to the tribunal and be questioned about my claims, I described how in 1971 my father and I traveled down to the Aerojet Corporation facility in Socorro, New Mexico, and we were shown moving images. We were shown a film of the South Tower strike on 9/11 of 01, 30 years in the future, because that had been quantum accessed by Project Pegasus.
Wow.
And it was a researcher whose work I admire and whose views I share, Dr. James Fetzer. I'm totally on the same page with Jim Fetzer about the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
As somebody interested in American musicology, we share a common interest in the whole controversy of whether Paul McCartney of the Beatles died on September 11th of 66 and was replaced by another musician who has impersonated him ever since, the so-called Paul versus Fall controversy, the Paul is dead controversy. And so Jim Fetzer and I should see eye to eye. We should be friends, not just colleagues, because we have these common interests. I mean, I have original findings I've made about the Kennedy assassination that I should have been able to share with him, for example, when we both appeared at the second Free Your Mind conference in Philadelphia in 2013, in April of 2013. But I was unable to because as a result of my filing of my affidavit about seeing images of 9/11 30 years before the event, Dr. Fetzer and his colleague, Dr. Kevin D. Barrett, and Barbara Honegger, a former assistant to Donald Rumsfeld, essentially wrote hundreds of emails attacking my testimony before it was offered before the tribunal, which ultimately led to the collapse of the tribunal, which was going to be undertaken by the more than able Judge Alfred Webre and the more than able Judge Connie Fogel. And it was going to be an independent inquiry into 9/11 that would have addressed some of these unaddressed issues. And so in my brief at Yelm, describing how the truth movement is failing, I made the point here that, look, how many 9/11 truthers are familiar with my testimony? My testimony got strangled in the cradle by Jim Fetzer and Kevin Barrett. My testimony, as Alfred identified in an article when I first shared my information with him about that matter, may solve the actual insider involvement in 9/11, which is to say that the very insiders who may have propagated the event, or at least let it happen, had prior knowledge of it, because, of course, Donald Rumsfeld, who was defense secretary on 9/11, was the defense attaché to Project Pegasus. So it's a critical smoking gun set of facts that I had to share with the 9/11 truther movement that got suppressed because individuals who I should see eye to eye with, and I certainly see eye to eye with on other conspiracies, even pop conspiracies like the one involving Paul McCartney, didn't want to admit my information into their dimension. And so they said, your dimension is invalid. Your experience of your dimension of reality didn't happen because I can't believe it could happen in my dimension. That's epistemologically invalid. That doesn't mean everybody who's making up a story or lying, or in the case of what I've identified Gaia doing, of literally taking facts from previous claimants and spinning them through controlled claimants. It doesn't mean there aren't threats to the validity of people's claims. But the notion that somebody can censor somebody else's testimony simply because they don't believe it, and then therefore say ipso facto you can't be telling the truth, that's an attribute of the scientific materialism.
That's what we have to address.
Well, that's an aspect of the scientific materialism that made the great villains of ufology, like Phil Klass. That's what made their approach invalid, is saying your reality can't be true because it's not in my reality. Well, we take it as a given that these kinds of accounts, that's why I mentioned Whitley Strieber at the top of the show, and the synchronicity involving Facebook urging me to renew my friendship with Whitley. You find in Whitley... No, let me finish. You find in Whitley Strieber's work an understanding of this fact that when we're talking about multidimensional experience, we're in that realm, I dare say it's almost a fuzzy logic realm, where we don't have all the information. We don't know precisely what's going on. I would challenge anybody in ufology to say, explain how the small gray ETs put Tanya Maidenford, Alfred Webre, and Andy Basiago together 30 years before they worked with each other, because they did in my brain. And it was clearly an abduction experience, either psychological or physical. Okay, so these were the kinds of things I addressed. Yep, that we have to move beyond this impasse. It doesn't mean we believe everybody, but what I'm calling for is a principle, a code of ethics that would maintain what I call objectified open-mindedness. Objectified open-mindedness says, at the end of the day, when I finally get everything you're talking about, I might not believe you. But while you're talking about your experience, while I'm considering what you're saying, and when I'm trying to relate it to what other people experience are claiming, I'm going to remain open-minded because the very cause of your experiences may be a multidimensional factor that I don't have access to. So, for example, when Lindsay approached me, I said, Lindsay, I remember saying that to somebody as I was leaving Mars. Watch out for this girl for me. And she remembered it happening in the waking state, and I remembered it from dream time, which suggests that two different people can have the same experience, with one having it in the diurnal waking state and one in the nocturnal dreaming state. Okay, that's a possible explanation. So, So that's where I was going with all.
Don't come back to you. Just let him in.
But just in the 3D that we're here, and we're looking at the truth movement in this 3D reality. The truth movement means that we are talking about the murder of children in the 3D, that we're talking about a terrible war. We're talking about reptilian control. We're talking about terrible things here in just 3D reality, and we've got to face those things too, because what happens with the truth movement is that you're going to see that Rumsfeld and those guys are mass genociders, and there's going to be they need to be removed from any authority on this planet, in my not humble opinion.
We get so bogged down in the distractions, the debates, the ego, the strutting and the alphaing and the I'm better and my better, and we miss the point, and that's why they succeed, and we're down here.
Look, I'm the faithful witness to the truth. I first revealed publicly that Donald Rumsfeld had been involved in U.S. time travel research before his 40th birthday in 2004. Alfred may remember my account going back to 2000 when I was sharing the data with him to back myself up from assassination by alerting several distinguished lawyers about what the information I was holding. That was my defensive approach.
Right now? If you have that information, you're talking about the past. Is there somewhere where they can click and read it, or go to YouTube? Where is that information now? It'll be on this YouTube.
I've done over 100 interviews. I've been disseminating it all over the internet. But what I'm saying is, a consensus reality, for example, that Rumsfeld was involved in time travel and then basically architected that Bush-Cheney-Rumsfeld team. I have been placing information about that out for 20 years now, but in the public domain for 13 years. I'm saying, though, it's primarily been figures within the truth movement that have undermined the value, the important things we should be talking about. I was following up on what you just said, that Sasha just said about
outdate your information. Andy, you get people questioning your reality all the time. Do they not believe it? Or is it an objective of the powers that be to take you out and your agenda out? Is it probably, what is here?
Let me make something clear. In the old days, in the 70s and 80s, in ufology and in psi research and so forth, you could have a pissing contest between a Dr. Eldon Bird and a Dr. James Randi, and it was basically even became a defamation lawsuit. But it was basically about whether or not psi was real. Okay. Now, when I marched through my interactions with these 35 figures in the truth movement, the audience was like astonished. People were like moaning when I was describing the things that had happened. How, for example, I took some original information about the Richard Doty case to Linda Moulton Howe, describing how he had played her and he had given her real elements and discoveries of Project Pegasus, and then spun it as a ploy to give her disinformation. And instead of sending me a responsive email and entering into communication with me, Linda did not respond, had me investigated. The investigator later revealed to me that she had me investigated. And what she left in the public domain were the claims of the head of Air Force security, Air Force intelligence at the Kirtland Air Force Base, and not the countervailing information of a crusading Democrat lawyer from Washington State, namely myself personally, regarding what Richard Doty had placed in the public domain. In other words, I don't think anybody would argue that Linda's revealed a lot of really important information, from cattle mutilations to Antarctica. But in my interaction with her, she subverted the truth, and she allowed the unilateral claims of a government official, the top Air Force Office of Special Investigations officer at the Kirtland Air Force Base, Richard Doty. She allowed his claims to be heard, and she blocked my countervailing information. This is just an example of the interactions with 35 truth figure movements that I've had interaction.
How did she? Can't you just put it up on Facebook and put the thread there, or put it up on your own website?
What she forced me to do is basically, I put up a graphic that described my interactions with Linda that I had posted, just in the same way that Ed Dames interviewed me on Coast to Coast AM on November 10th of 2011 in a kind of a sidebar agreement with Tom Danheiser at Coast. I was the first. Look, I wasn't just accused of 222 atrocities. I wasn't just accused of being a non-person, that Richard Hoagland was spelling my name and down my surname, Basiago, with a small case B in quotation marks in hard parens, that I was a non-person. I was the first guest in the history of Coast to Coast AM to be subject to an ambush interview by another guest arranged by the producers of the program. That's when Ed Dames came on and denied that he was our Mars training officer, even though myself and Willings and Bernard Mendez and William Whitecrow, 4 people who were in the project, have affirmed each other's testimony, have confirmed each other's testimony that Ed Dames was our instructor. Okay, so what I'm saying is these aren't cynical journalists in the mainstream. Yeah. These people in the truth who have attacked my discourse with these unethical approaches.
We understand. Alfred, what do you have to interject?
Yeah, I would like to place the following on the record, because Andy just mentioned the Coast to Coast. And I think that is, I just want to get my notes here. And I think it's important to place this on the record. You recall the May 24th date that I mentioned when I announced this, the first news of the fact that Jimmy Carter, myself, and Andy Basiago had been had been abducted, and that I hired PR Web to do a national PR. Well, Coast to Coast, since its inception, has been run by two women, essentially, and Lisa Lyons and her assistant Stephanie. The male hosts, ranging from Art Bell to George Nuri, come and go. But the two people who have kept Coast to Coast on the air over the years have been Lisa Lyons and her assistant Stephanie. The two women have kept that stable. And they are two excellent people. And so I sent it out, and Lisa Lyons called me up personally. And she was like amazed. And she instantly put me down for, I sent it out on May 24th, and she said 2 hours, midnight to 2 a.m. on May 30th. And incidentally, May 30th, they had, the newspapers had publicized that as the 100th anniversary of JFK's birth. And that was significant because there's a rumor that JFK and Jimmy Carter are half-brothers, because Lillian Carter was Joe Kennedy's secretary in the 1920s, and they had a dalliance, and Lillian Carter became pregnant and was sent back to Georgia, married to Mr. Carter, and the result was Jimmy Carter. And there may be some validity to that.
That's wonderful.
There may be some validity to.
That's great. Sasha.
There may be some validity. Listen, love makes the world go round, right?
Yeah, it's great.
And there may be some validity to that, because Representative Henry B. Gonzalez in 1976, because I was very active in the trying to solve the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and he called me down to Washington to meet with him. We had lunch in the congressional dining room to get his House Select Committee on Assassination started for the investigation, among others, of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I helped him because I was widely connected to all the assassination researchers in the community throughout the United States. I was co-director of the Assassination Information Bureau with Carl Oglesby and others, and I was connected with assassination researchers on all coasts and in between. And so in the interim, after Jimmy Carter was elected president in November, and in December, he sent a prominent attorney from Atlanta who called me up from the Carlisle Hotel in New York. I went over and had a meeting with him there. And he said, President Carter, I'm here on behalf of President Carter, and he wants to maintain connection with the House Select Committee on Assassination. And he approached me because I was an intermediary to Representative Gonzalez. And so I said, great. And so then he invited me to a lunch on Capitol Hill at a dinner on Capitol Hill, a house, at which members of Carter Inner Circle were present. And these are people who called Carter Peanut. Carter, they called him JC and the 12 Apostles. It was a whole thing about Jimmy Carter. He is a light being, as opposed to Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission, was the author of the single bullet theory. He's a fellow Yale Law graduate and puts Yale Law School to shame. I'm a Yale Law graduate. Okay, so, and at that dinner, what came to me, and this is probably from the briefings on the spacecraft, the Carter, Webre, Basiago briefings, I said to myself at the dinner, oh, well, we should have the Jimmy Carter White House extraterrestrial study. This is the first scientific study because after the 1966 or 1967 Michigan UFO flap, Gerald Ford called in Robert McNamara as a witness in the congressional hearings on UFOs to say, yes, Mr. Ford, they're all swamp gas. We investigated them at the Defense Department. Can you imagine that?
Oh, my God.
That's what McNamara said. So as a result of Jimmy Carter sending this lawyer, and then the lawyer inviting me to Capitol Hill dinner with the inner circle, they all said, "You gonna work with Peanut?" It was so funny. I mean, I'm just kind of recalling there was a real spirit at the inner circle of Jimmy Carter. There was a real spirit, and that man is extraordinary. He was just here in Winnipeg building houses for Habitat for Humanity. And 2 days ago, he's 91 years old. He was nailing on a house, and he was struck by the heat, and he collapsed because of dehydration. I mean, I was in awe. I mean, that man is in awe. He is absolutely incredible.
We hear a lot about Jimmy Carter from experiencers. George Green said that he was told that if he stayed on board, he's being hired as a financial advisor for the next president, and he said, "Oh, who's the next president?" And they said, "Well, it's a new guy named Jimmy Carter." But I remember, is he a Democrat or Republican? George said, "I'm a Republican. I won't work for a Democrat." And they said, "Well, it doesn't matter, George. They're both the same. But this guy Carter, he's running on the Democratic ticket." So we heard about him. Gloria Hawker, who's an experiencer, she said that Carter was in an underground base in White Sands. He was there with Reagan, and they were all hanging around doing stuff with all kinds of extraterrestrials. Who else? Oh, then Joanne Richards said Carter was the one that said, "Go rescue the people with Dulce." And there was another reference to Carter. Carter's all over the place with experiencers, having seen him in underground installations and onboard ships and involved with different things. So I really agree with what's going on here. That you have another story about Carter being involved. So I think we're onto something here.
Yeah.
Let me just emphasize that my connection to Carter is collateral through Alfred, because I saw Carter speak on May 5th of 1979 in Los Angeles, and that's the extent of my interaction with him. I certainly don't have any non-ordinary memories linking myself to Carter, but then I do remember the encounters with Alfred after his abduction, but before his work for Carter on the ET human communication study. So,
yeah.
Just to be clear,
I see that we're just about 5 minutes away from the end of the program, so I just wanted to interject that in my judgment, Carter, the intent of the ETs, because I was I am a bridge figure between what I believe to be two disclosure presidents, Jimmy Carter and Andy Basiago, and I'm knocking on wood here because I believe that Andy Basiago will be the disclosure president who will bring planetary teleportation, who will, if it doesn't happen before, abrogate our treaties with the manipulatory ETs and have us rejoin the community of ethical ETs and the community of Agartha with the inner earth. So I just wanted to say that the primary purpose, I think, of my being that bridge figure is to facilitate, and what the short grays have done is to facilitate the bridge between the two disclosure presidents, which were Jimmy Carter and the future president, Andy Basiago. And that is a vision, I think, that we should all carry, and that we should all bring into reality at andy2020.net. And so that's what I'd like to leave everybody with.
Yeah, thank you for that endorsement, Alfred. Yeah, I will do my best. I would note that I've already had 17 of my 100 proposals were truth-oriented, and all of the major ET transparency issues were addressed in my 100 proposals. And with slight modification, they have become and they will continue to be part of my 2020 campaign for the presidency. And I will be the truth president if, in their wisdom, the American people decide to elect me their president. At this stage, I'm just really clearing the air about the last 10 or 15 years of truth advocacy on my own part, because, it got to the point where, because of these issues of ego and lack of ethicality and epistemological error in the truth movement, people were accusing me of atrocities. I've lived a loving and responsible life, and I was being accused of atrocities, and my work was being inhibited. It was being frustrated because people were believing the claims. So we really, look, if the truth movement is going to prevail, we're going to have to be better than the common culture has been at exploring these issues, because these issues are part of people's reality. We do live in a multidimensional world. And, even just on the level of historiography, this faith that the cynics and the critics have in documents is a completely spurious misuse and misapplication of historiography. It's been true since the late 1980s, at least, maybe the mid-1980s, at the university history level, that eyewitness testimony is at least as valuable as documentary evidence, because you can interview and cross-examine a living witness. But let's say compare a living witness to something like the things I experienced, time traveling for the Defense Department going back to 1970, 68, 69, 70. I'm more valuable as a witness than something that somebody wrote in some FBI memorandum 50 years ago. I mean, an FBI agent or CIA agent who writes a memorandum could have been inebriated. They could have been trafficking in gossip or rumor. Their facts may not have been true. So when a Richard Dolan or a Michael Salla or any of the other sort of academically oriented gatekeepers in the truth movement tell us that it only matters if it can be documented on a piece of paper, that is simply not true. That's not where current historiography is at. We have to listen to people's accounts, and we have to really get a hand on what they're describing, and then we can begin correlating what they're talking about to the claims of others. We can find, as Dr. Salla has pledged in a new project with me, Michael has become my ally, because we're both going to be going in search under the Freedom of Information Act for information that validates my time travel claims. And if that book works out, we'll then do one about my Mars claims. So, by maintaining...
Question. Are we still broadcasting? Or did we go off air?
Yeah, I just want to say that we've been on the air for 1 hour and 43 minutes. So we've got 13 minutes left on the air.
Okay, I thought we were going off at 1 o'clock. Okay.
I was looking at the clock, but now I'm looking at the recorder, and we've got 12 minutes and 15 seconds left.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure we're still broadcasting. Okay,
and Go
ahead.
And I'll give you a signal when we have about 30 seconds left.
Yeah, put your hand up, or minute or time or whatever it is.
Good. Okay.
So all of us pay attention to the images. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Who has, do you have anything else you want to say, Alfred? We'll go back to, did you want to say something?
I'm fine for the moment.
Go ahead. Okay. Go ahead. Did you want to say something, Sash?
Let's see if I can remember what it's just that I think that we're in an interaction with the whole, and that the whoever or whatever force arranges things has used us avatars to work out a game, and to give us the opportunity to play the game, and to play the game in a way that lets us transcend the game. And that's what I think, accepting the multidimensionality, the kind of approach that you and Andy are giving us is a way that we can really do better. And I think it's almost inevitable, and we have to free the slaves on the bases in Mars, and free the slaves and the people that are being abducted by MILABs and hostile ETs. This stuff's going on, and it's an accursed thing that we can all feel in our hearts, and it moves us to do something about it. That's what I think the focus of it is.
Back to you, Andy.
And we're about 8 years behind, because in fact, in my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, I showed that in a ravine west of the home plate plateau, as depicted in NASA JPL image 10214, the ravine is filled with hundreds of humanoid bodies dressed in both male and female clothing, uniformly sky blue clothing that suggests regimentation. So that, for example, this, again, in terms of relevance and significance, I notified Robert David Steele. When Robert David Steele recently went on the Alex Jones show to talk about his belief that abducted children may be the victims of enslavement on Mars, I shot him a brief email about the fact that my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, showed images of this ravine that is either a place of ritual human sacrifice, an open air cemetery of some kind, or maybe a genocidal killing field. But that what's disturbing about the images is the bodies are all uniformly clothed in sky blue pants and shirt for the males, and in sort of mid-calf length dresses for the females. And in one part of the ravine, you can actually see a huge serpent slithering across the bodies. So this goes to, again, why we need to suspend disbelief in our initial evaluation of people's claims. That evidence, that photographic evidence, has been in the public domain since 2008. And I can commend Alfred for being the first figure in exopolitics to publish my paper at exopolitics.com. And here we are, it's 2017, 9 years later, and Robert David Steele goes on the Alex Jones show and talks about the possibility that missing children are being taken to Mars, and the jackals in the mainstream media attack him as and discredit him, trying to describe other strange beliefs he has and so forth. And they basically implement that Robertson panel kind of attack, where you subject people who make claims to extraterrestrial experience to what? Public smear campaigns involving fear and ridicule. That's what I've been subjected to roundly within the truth movement itself, and that's why I'm speaking out. And what I will do is I will write up my interactions with these 35 individuals to show that as I tried to present the truth about time travel and American visitation to Mars over the last 15 years, my efforts have been undermined for the most part by agent provocateurs within the truth movement, but then secondarily with a mainstream media that does not report the truth, that uses unethical techniques to unethically attack people who have difficult information that they're seeking to share, and by the reluctance of the common culture itself to examine new evidence. I mean, my data on the bodies on Mars has been out there for 9 years now, and I haven't received a single call from the FBI, from any congressional investigators, from any human rights organizations. Everybody has acted like it doesn't matter that a NASA image shows a ravine on Mars full of bodies that are uniformly clothed. I mean, come on.
Yes.
What would be more worthy of investigating?
I'm going to interview in the next couple months. It's a woman. She said she was taken to Mars when she was 5 and put in their program. like you were talking about, in their whatever it is, their slave camp. And I have a fellow I'm interviewing, I think tomorrow, and he was he was abducted, but he was immediately put into a military program. Next thing he knew, was fighting aliens. So there's all kinds of stories coming forth now, which we have to look into. But right now, I'm just documenting and interviewing these people. We have 4 minutes left, so let's do a wrap up round here. Alfred, did you want to say something?
We actually have 11 minutes left.
Oh, 11. I'm sorry, I was misinterpreting you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do we want to cover?
I'd like to say something for the record, and it's following up on Andy's point that the media, in this case, the alt, actually very powerful mainstream media, are actively engaged in covering up. Okay, and that is that on May 24th, 2017, which, as I said, was the day that Christ consciousness landed, I sent out the PR web announcement of announcing the Jimmy Carter, Andy Basiago, Alfred Webre abduction, which has to do with the liberation of the planet from the reptilian pedocriminal matrix, and with all of the program that the short grays really want to bring an improvement on the planet. And Lisa Lyons immediately scheduled me for the 2 hours from midnight to 2 a.m., as it turns out, on the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's birth, which is very symbolic because, as it turns out, there's some proof that John F. Kennedy and Jimmy Carter were half-brothers. And that is also reinforced by the fact that, as I mentioned, Jimmy Carter sent this emissary to me, the Atlanta lawyer, who said that he wanted to stay in touch with the House Select Committee on Assassinations because it was very important to him. He invited me to a dinner, and it was at that dinner in 3D that the whole Jimmy Carter, 1977 Jimmy Carter White House extraterrestrial was born. And when I went to call on the night of the broadcast, on that Tuesday night, where we were going to do the 2-hour broadcast, I went online and I noticed that they had scheduled another broadcast. In fact, they scheduled a broadcast with a UFO researcher who had called me about a week earlier to be on my show. And so I called up Lisa Lyons and I said, "Lisa, what's happening?" And she said, "We're not going to do the show." And so I said, "Lisa, you guys are playing me, because just a week earlier, on May 21st, 2017, Tom Danheiser, the producer of Coast to Coast, had called me and asked me to be on George Nuri's program on Gaia TV, if I could be on that. He called me just a week earlier, actually less than a week earlier, on May 21st, and asked me to be on George Nuri's show. And I said, George Nuri is the host of George Nuri's show on Gaia TV, and he's the host of Coast to Coast. How come you're not going to do it? George Nuri said, "We're just not going to do it." And she said, and I said to Lisa, I said, "Lisa, you guys are playing me." And Lisa said, "I just apologize." And we both hung up, because Lisa is a person of integrity. And then I want to read this on the air officially, okay? Because it's more proof. And then I called up a person who I've interviewed. I'm not going to mention his name, but I've interviewed him on Exopolitics TV a number of times. He's extremely psychic, and he's a person that does reports for people and he's like a remote viewer. He can look into situations. And I asked him, why did they cancel me? Why did Coast to Coast cancel me? Namely, it was George Noory that overrode the decision of Lisa Lyons, who's the producer of the program, who's actually been there from day one and who has kept the program going from Art Bell through George Noory, through all of them. He says, hi, Alfred, here's what I get. I write each thing down that I think is important. Number one, they were ordered to cancel you as they received funds from the deep state. This is Coast to Coast. Two,
Yes.
it is too close to the subject of disclosure. Three, they don't like that you with Andy had an inside track on time travel. Four, they aren't allowed to interview you because you being personally involved with them know too much, and it's too likely something the deep state don't like will come out on the air. Five, your interview will put others on the right track as they saw this looking ahead in time. Six, your interview will cause a lot more people to go elsewhere to News Inside Out, our channel, which will hurt them. Seven, your interview will alert others that they are using time technology against us, causing others to adjust to this, making their time technology less effective. This is all I get that I'm told is important. I hope this helps.
Wow.
Maybe you can do or fix some of these things. Okay? I just wanted to say that people have to know that George Noory and those control factors in Coast to Coast is working for the dark side, for the reptilian controllers, and he actively suppressed this vital information as to the short grays that were working with and had set up the abduction, the positive abductions of Jimmy Carter, Alfred Webre, Andy Basiago, that was to have been announced on the 100th anniversary of the birth of John F. Kennedy, who was a great president and maybe the half-brother of Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter was personally involved, wanted to be personally involved with the House Select Committee on Assassination. He sent a personal emissary to me to work with that. And that's the level of corruption that George Noory at Coast to Coast works in. It should be officially known. So I've now stated it for the record. We're in the age where the rubber meets the road. This is personal accountability. This is it, folks. You've got to make your choices. You listen to the truth, or you continue to eat information that is going to hurt your soul and your career in this universe. Over to you.
Over to you, Andy. How
Well,
many minutes do we have, Alfred? Alfred, what's our time? How many more minutes?
Okay, it's 1:57. We've got 2 minutes and 20 seconds.
Go, Andy.
Go, Andy.
Ultimately, I find the exercise that I've been involved in recently in sort of clearing the air about how my truth campaign of over a decade now has been undermined by defects within the truth community itself as a negative enterprise. For example, when I defended myself against my Mars findings, I found that it was a zero-sum game because I couldn't find more things on Mars. In a similar way, when I'm stepping back and analyzing what happened in the sort of the sociology of my revelations, I'm only doing this momentarily, and then I'm going to return basically to just sharing my truth again, because I don't want to become either somebody who's constantly defending himself against attacks on the one hand, or that is putting himself in the role of the critic or censor or academic gatekeeper for other people's experiences. I'm going to try to promote a discourse based on objectified open-mindedness, but also hold those accountable who are mimicking other people's claims. Hold them accountable for doing so, because in the delivery of our own truth, it has to be our own truth rather than some kind of contrived discourse, some kind of contrived narrative. The problem right now, honestly, in the truth movement is that truth tellers are being suppressed and contrived experiences are being elevated. And that's a serious matter, and that's why I spoke out. That's why I stopped simply sharing my own experiences to step back and say, well, these are the nature of my interactions with these 35 people in the movement. The broad picture is one in which those telling the truth are being attacked, often mercilessly.
We've run out of time. I'm sorry, but Andy's going to be at the Newfound Symposium next weekend. This is the 15th. What is the date? 20. I think the.
What town?
20, back in Las Vegas, Nevada. Yes, at the Newfound Symposium.
We're all going to be in Yale, Washington. Alfred, what are the dates? Do you have that? The
yes,
last weekend.
July 28th to 30th, 2017.
Okay. So, Yale UFO Festival, and we're out of time. Much love and blessings and aloha. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Alfred. Thank
Aloha.
you, Sasha.
Mahalo.